listener production.
Hey, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. Yesterday, Donald Trump announced he'd had a phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, kicking off a process to finally end the war in Ukraine. As the world waits to find out what this means for a war that's been going on for so long, what do Ukrainians want most of all?
Ukrainians do not want to give up 1 centimetre of soil of Ukraine. It's been stolen, it's been invaded, it's been taken from Ukraine.
A Ukrainian in Australia gives her verdict on the negotiations as they continue to unfold, and that's coming up in the second half of this episode. First, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spiru on Friday, February 14.
Morning Sash, morning everybody, and happy Friday. The 2 New South Wales health nurses who bragged about not treating and killing Israeli patients have been banned from practising anywhere in Australia. Federal Health Minister Mark Butler confirming last night both Ahmed Rashad Nadir and Sarah Abu Lebdeh from Bankstown Hospital in Sydney's southwest have been deregistered, saying Australians have a right to feel safe wherever they go and nowhere should be safer than a hospital. In his statement, Butler went on to describe the pair's comments as sickening, underpinned by hatred and running against every single principle in our healthcare system. If you didn't catch this story in yesterday's headlines, here's a reminder of what the nurses said while on a video call with Israeli content creator Max Vifa earlier in the week.
Let's say an Israeli, God forbid.
I won't treat them. I'll kill them.
Okay, you have no idea how many Israeli dog came to this hospital and I sent him to Jahannam. I literally sent him to Jahannam.
The pair were quickly stood down by New South Wales Health on Wednesday, and police are continuing to investigate the matter. Yesterday, speaking with Vifa, who they say will release the full unedited version of the video chat to them as they consider laying charges.
Meantime, around 100 New South Wales nurses and midwives took to Sydney's CBD yesterday, pausing their plans to hold a picket line for higher pay, instead to rally against hate speech. They slammed Nadir and Lebdeh's comments as appalling and also devastating, pleading with the community not to take their anger out on healthcare workers.
The members were saying overnight they have copped abuse from the public. They have felt the anger from the public. Please, public, this is not us. This is not who we are as a profession.
That was President of the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association, Aubrey Smith, speaking there. Now, as we discussed yesterday, Nadir has issued an apology via his lawyer to Vifa and the wider Jewish community, also mentioning that it was a joke, which I don't think it's particularly funny. But more recently, we've heard from Lebdeh's brother, who says she was baited and the unedited video will show that she was provoked and snapped as anyone would, quote unquote. So her brother spoke to the Daily Mail saying that his sister wanted to help rather than hurt people, and that they had 70 family members be killed in Palestine. So trying to justify why she had that strong stance against Israelis. Either way, as the health minister has said and as the commentary has been, our public hospitals should be the safest place in the world to go. You should never feel like you're not going to be treated or be safe because of who you are, where you're from or what you believe in. So that's the important thing to take away.
You might remember at the start of this week, we spoke about Hamas threatening not to release any further hostages, claiming Israel had violated their ceasefire deal. The group said at the time that critical aid was being blocked from entering Gaza, Israeli troops hadn't opened access to northern parts of the Strip, and were continuing to shoot at Palestinians in the West Bank. It appears now that talks to continue negotiating the ceasefire, currently happening in Qatar and Egypt, have delivered a breakthrough.
Yeah, Hamas has made a statement saying it will continue with the planned release of hostages, with another 3 to be handed back to Israel on Saturday. Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, it's worth noting, had threatened to reignite the war if the hostages were not released as initially agreed. The Israeli PM too, though, was facing pressure at home to not start launching strikes again, and this was coming from families of the people still being held in Gaza. This is something that they finally were going to see their loved ones returned home, albeit in a staggered way, but they were coming home, and they were really angry at this talk that the ceasefire was going to end. However, there are also far-right members of Netanyahu's coalition government who have been agitating for strikes to resume and for the ceasefire to be called off.
There's talk Anthony Albanese could be calling the election this weekend. It comes as the Pollies wrap up their first and maybe last 2 sitting weeks of Parliament for 2025, and all the indications suggest we're in for a March or early April election. Let's take a look at the sign, Sash. So first, Labor managed to get through a couple of legislative wins, so some of them being 3 days of subsidised childcare for almost all Australian families, electoral funding reforms, and toughened hate speech laws. At the same time, it dumped a few policies that were stalling, like the nature positive laws.
Secondly, the Prime Minister seemed to be practising his attack lines that we'll likely be seeing on the campaign trail.
The Leader of the Opposition was a senior minister for every day of the former government. Every day. Every Australian will remember all too well what he means when he speaks about going back.
Now, he also sparked a flurry of speculation when he started visiting newsrooms in the press gallery at Parliament House yesterday. Now, that's something he hasn't done since he won the 2022 vote, and he was popping into newsrooms and saying hello and having a little tour. So if these hints are anything to go by, Albanese could call it this weekend, or by March 23rd, which is 2 days out from the budget. Now, that would mean we would not hear the March budget handed down and would instead be thrust into an election campaign. And with those dates, the vote might fall as early as March 22, that's if he calls it this weekend, or as late as April 12. So I feel silly doing this. I feel like we've been speculating since the end of last year. Was he about to call it? These really are the strongest indications we've had. We also heard a couple of ministers and backbenchers make remarks about, asking questions on their last day. Albo even said it of a veteran backbencher who was being ejected from question time yesterday, and he said, not on his last day, Mr. Speaker. So
That's a really good impression too, actually.
they all sound the same in there. Signs are strong. But, we've been speculating for so long. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. But a quick update as well, while we're speaking of federal politics, on the by-election in Werribee in Melbourne, which obviously that vote was last Saturday. It was on a knife's edge and it was really head-to-head between the Labor and Liberal candidates. But now it looks like Labor is on track to retaining that seat.
And happy Valentine's Day to our briefers. But also I'm a little curious to know, have you woken up single today? And I'm asking because there's new data suggesting half of Aussies break up with someone the day before Valentine's Day. And
That's so crap.
And that's something our very own Helen Smith deep dive yesterday. And there were some fascinating comments on our TikTok about it as well. The first one I want to draw to your attention, Sasha Barbagat, is from a user named Rock Paper Stilettos. Speaking about breaking up on Valentine's Day Eve, she said, "That's fine. I would rather that than after I gave them a present."
True.
Yeah.
And you haven't had to fork out for dinner?
Yeah, not bad logic
Yeah,
at
you haven't
all.
had to get dressed up. You can stay in.
Another comment is from user ADHD lol, and they wrote, "True for me," which is a little bit sad. I'm sorry to that user. And then the last comment comes from a user named Your Mum, and they wrote, "If your love interest calls in sick to your date today, they're probably with someone else."
Oof, ouch. Well, yes, happy Valentine's Day to everyone who wants to celebrate it. Not everyone does, but if you do, have a lovely day. Thank you for joining us for the briefing headlines this week. We, of course, have another deep dive coming up right now, and we're diving into what a Ukrainian Australian wants to see happen as Putin, Zelensky and Trump start negotiating the end of the Ukraine invasion.
Hey, Bension here. Are Ukrainians willing to give up justice and fairness and accept the totally abhorrent if it gets them peace? Yesterday, Donald Trump announced to the world that he's been on the phone to Russian President Vladimir Putin, kicking off what he claims will be a process towards peace in Ukraine. Trump's defense secretary, the former Fox News host Pete Hegseth, meanwhile told US allies in no uncertain terms Ukraine will have to give up some of its territory for the sake of peace, and joining NATO is not, quote, a realistic outcome. Remember, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. It's this military alliance between European countries, the UK and the United States, where every country agrees to come to the defence of any other country in the alliance if Russia invades any one of them. So if Ukraine had been a member of NATO before the Russian invasion, we might all be in a world war right now. Or maybe Russia would have been too scared of just that and never invaded in the first place. But Ukrainians have said for a very long time, we want peace and we want to be in NATO, but we won't be giving up any territory to Russia. So now that Trump says he's brought Putin to the negotiating table, what will Ukrainians be willing to give up for a shot at peace? This is all very personal for Chrestyna Kmetj from the Ukrainian Australian Federation, who has a challenging message for us. What would Australians be willing to give up if we were invaded? Chrestyna, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Pleasure to be with you, Bension. Thank you.
What is your immediate reaction to the news that President Trump and President Putin have had a, quote, lengthy and highly productive conversation on the phone about ending the Ukraine war?
Immediate response? Started to read up on it because so much comes out that's correct and false currently about the war in Ukraine. And one thing that came through very clearly, Bension, was that there is a shock amongst Ukrainians in Ukraine and in the world and in Europe in particular as to the response for what President Trump has said following his call with Putin for us overnight.
What was your emotional reaction to that news?
Emotions for us are a roller coaster at the moment. Every day we watch to see what's actually happening in Ukraine. We get messages from family and friends, and most other Australians, I would say, wouldn't be aware of the constant bombardment that is happening in Ukraine 24/7. So our emotions are up and down. You know, there's another wave of drones or more ballistic missiles, more people killed, more towns and cities that have been levelled. So our emotions are always a roller coaster, but this is just tipping us a little bit further to the edge of where do we go to from here. Hearing it that the US government is saying that while they stand committed to Ukrainian independence, they're also very much supportive of the Russian side of the war.
Trump administration officials have said that there's been prisoner exchange, which may portend renewed efforts to end the war. How do you feel about the idea of Russian fighters being freed in exchange for the safety of captured Ukrainians?
Benson, I think this is just an outcome of war, and it might sound awful. However, the flip side of that is that Ukrainian soldiers are returned, and people that have been held in captivity, tortured in horrendous ways. Ukrainian soldiers that were ordered to stand, hard to even repeat this, one by one, walk away from the Russian soldiers, and they were shot dead. So they saw the soldiers, their friends, prior to them being shot dead, and then they were shot dead. So a prisoner exchange, of course, then brings people home, and that's the upside. Of course, a lot of Russian soldiers desert, and the Korean soldiers, the North Korean soldiers that have been brought in, many of them are deserting as well. And it's well known amongst the Ukrainian community that they are sent in, as they say, as meat fodder. They literally just throw in masses of North Koreans and Russians to take Ukrainian territory, and they just die. It's awful. It's an awful war, Benson.
The arguably most important part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, is that if you attack one, you attack all. Is it fair enough for Europeans not to want there to be the case that if Russia attacks Ukraine, for example, then Europe and Russia must be in a war against each other?
It's interesting, in recent travels over recent years and travels into Ukraine during this full-scale invasion and also around Europe, the solidarity of European countries for Ukraine is evident everywhere. If you go to London, Ukrainian flags still, to this day, fly on Westminster. Europeans are very aware that the Russian threat is not just to Ukraine, that the approaching force of Russia has no bounds. And this is evident in the growth of NATO in recent years, with countries that we thought would never, ever join NATO and the awareness of the threat of Russia at this time. And it's bizarre to talk about this in this day and age. I feel like I'm talking about an episode that might be in Star Wars or something, but this is the reality of life in Europe.
What would Ukrainians, including yourself and other Ukrainians in Australia, say that they would be willing to sacrifice for the sake of peace?
Sacrifice. It's a hard word, isn't it? Ukrainians do not want to give up 1 centimetre of soil of Ukraine. It's been stolen. It's been invaded. It's been taken from Ukraine. 20% of the Ukrainian territory has been taken by Russia. Imagine if 20% of Australia was taken. What bit of Australia would we be giving up? Would we give up South Australia? Would we give up Tasmania? What would we give up to? In all seriousness, would Australians sit back and say, hey, yeah, guys, you can have South Australia. We don't really need it. We don't need the assets. We don't need the people. The people can be tortured. The children can be kidnapped and sent into another country and re-identified and reclassified as another nationality. Women can be raped. Ukrainians aren't prepared to give up Ukraine, and they shouldn't be, just as Australians should never be prepared to give up, dare I say, should we ever be under threat and give up any part of our country.
I guess this comes down to a question of whether you're willing to accept peace over justice, because the international legal system is set up to prefer peace over justice. Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, says that it's not a realistic outcome that Ukraine is going to get back all its territory, and the US is the main backer of the Ukrainian government. It's the main arms backer of the Ukrainian government. In a completely practical sense, even if it's awful, hideous, horrendous, is he correct that it's not realistic that Ukraine is going to maintain all of its previous territory?
After this announcement by Trump overnight, I was speaking with some friends that live in Kyiv. And if I may share with you their correspondence and their thoughts on this, and they've advised that Trump has stopped all military equipment shipments to Ukraine and ended all military funding. They're also advising that Europe is shocked, that this isn't something that, as an Australian, that we're in shock, but Europe is shocked. And the other thing that we need to take into account also is that Putin has had, following a 2023 investigation of war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide by the International Criminal Court, an arrest has been issued for Vladimir Putin. It's based on alleged responsibility for the war crime of unlawful deportation and transfer of children during the Russo-Ukrainian War, and that this is the first ever warrant against a leader of a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. However, dare I say, the irony in this is that the United States is not a member of the ICC. And when we hear about that Putin and Trump are saying that they will be meeting in the near future, we have a rules-based order of law. However, it doesn't truly exist. If I could just leave that for you to think about.
Do you trust Donald Trump to get peace in Ukraine?
I believe that Donald Trump is going to do everything he can to achieve peace. We just don't know. Nobody knows how Trump will execute that. And in reality, the ball's in his court. Trump has come in a whirlwind back into the White House. And of course, what will we get? It's not the insecurity, but the unknown factor of Trump always hangs over us. So I believe that something will be negotiated. Will it be fair? I think the history of the world is going to judge all of this and judge this war and judge this invasion and judge the carving up of Ukraine and judge the handing out of the mineral assets of Ukraine for peace.
Ukrainians have relocated to countries all over the world, including Australia, since the fighting broke out. Many have said repeatedly that they would want to go back the day that there's peace. If there is a peace agreement, would you or anyone else you know want to go back to Ukraine?
Cities are levelled. infrastructure is gone in many, many sections of Ukraine. So if we're looking from the east to the west, the east of Ukraine is desolate. It's flattened. It doesn't exist. The cities have been flattened. People cannot live there. There is no power. There is no water. You're looking at rebuilding 20% of a country so that people can actually return to live in cities or villages. Imagine village lifestyle. That's gone now. People can't live how they used to live. Will people be able to go back? What will they go back to? Will there be an economy that will be able to support them? In what capacity will they be able to live? These will be questions for Ukrainians. In relation to the Ukrainians that have come out here to seek refuge, because that is what they have done, and approximately 25 million Ukrainians are outside of Ukraine currently displaced because of this war. The numbers here in Australia are quite minimal. It fluctuates because people do come and go as they feel that it's safe to return, or there is some stability for them to return home. Currently, there's only roughly 10,000 Ukrainians that have remained in Australia. That question will be for them as to whether or not they feel that there is security for them and their children in the future.
If you had an opportunity to speak with Putin or Trump or Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, what would you say on behalf of Ukrainians around the world?
You may have to bleep out some words if I want to say what has become the catch cries of Ukrainians to Putin. Of course, that would just be the colloquial way of addressing him. However, I don't believe that man is capable of hearing anything unless there is any benefit for him in an outcome. And whoever will speak to him will have to put significant cards on the table for him to move, or to make his next move on what is literally a major chessboard for him. President Trump, it would be to ask him to hear the voices of Ukrainian children, ask him to hear the voices of Ukrainian mothers whose children have been stolen, ask him to hear the voices of people that have been raped, tortured, ask him to see what has become of so much of Ukraine, to open his eyes and with a clear conscience acknowledge that this is wrong and this is unlawful, and these people have the right to live on their own land safely and in peace and in a democratic way. Zelensky? Well, Zelensky showed the world, didn't he, what Ukrainian spirit is. Growing up here as a Melbourne girl in Australia, the multicultural community has always been incredible throughout Australia, and the ability to be able to share the Ukrainian culture growing up and still to this day throughout Australia has been truly a gift. However, growing up, spelling one's name, explaining where Ukraine is, people had no idea where Ukraine was or anything about our history. I still spell my name every day, say that it's a gift from my father. This is our culture. This is our identity. However, Zelensky put Ukraine and the spirit of Ukrainians forefront to the world and showed just how resilient, stubborn, strong, intelligent, hardworking, cultural, determined the Ukrainian people are, regardless of where they are. Just cast your mind back to those grandmothers, those bubbas that made Molotov cocktails in the first days to stop Kyiv from falling.
Chrestyna, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you for your time.
That was Chrestyna Kmetj speaking with me there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go, though, we would love it if you could share this app with someone who's eager to hear more about this developing story. It's a really easy way you can support us here at The Briefing. The Briefing is produced by Helen Smith, Chris Spiru, hosted by Sasha Barbagat and me, Bension Siebert. The show is imaged by Matt Curry and Chris Marsh, and The Briefing's executive producer is Jessica Wukyanov. Another episode of The Briefing will be in your feed today from 3. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.